Morgan. Thanks ever so much for joining the Open Science Cluster webinar today. I have posted the cluster meeting notes in the chat, as has Morgan. Thank you, Morgan. If you could add your name and email address to that document and any other notes you would like, that would be great. And for those who have not joined the cluster previously, so that the aim of the Open Science Cluster is really to kind of gather and share knowledge to increase awareness and adoption of open science. We have been going for about a year now, and over the last year we focused a lot around the identification of kind of emerging trends and themes in open science. We did kind of a number of mind mapping activities to really gather knowledge from the ESIP community. And we have now designed this webinar series that really aims to kind of focus on multiple themes and considerations in open science, specifically around trust considerations in open science and building trust with diverse audiences and stakeholder groups who traditionally may not have been involved in science. Secondly, around open science infrastructure considerations, that's the second theme. And then thirdly, open science incentives. And so this first set of webinars is on this first theme of trust considerations. And this is our first webinar, and we're really excited and grateful to have Dr. Andrea Thomer here with us today. And Andrea is an assistant professor at the University of Arizona in the School of Information. Her focus areas are on the maintenance and evolution of knowledge structures, scientific data curation, as well as information organization. And Andrea's research has been funded by NSF, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and others. And in this presentation, which is titled Past Global Change Research, Connecting Data Systems and Practitioners Through Fair and Care Practices, Andrea will discuss how communities of practice are developed around open science principles of fair and care. And Andrea will introduce the Past Global Change Research Coordination Network. We will leave time at the end of the presentation for questions, or if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can get to them at the end. You can also pop them in the cluster document and we'll capture them that way. And I think I covered everything. Did I miss, or does anybody have any initial comments? Okay, well, we will pass it over to Andrea, and thanks again for joining today.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thanks for that introduction. As you can see, I have a cat who is named Millhouse, and he is going to do his best to distract me for this entire presentation. So I apologize in advance if I wind up having to kick him out of the room. Okay, I'm going to share my slides, I think. Okay, and can everybody see? Okay, great. Yeah, so like Jenny said, I'm talking about, today I'm going to be presenting, trying to introduce this research coordination network that just got funded through NSF. That I think the shortest way to talk about it is to call it the Past Global Change Research Coordination Network. And this is something that just got funded over this last year or so. I think we officially started in January, and we just had our first symposium. And I'm really glad to be able to take it to this cluster and to ESIP in general, because I do think it's really relevant to discussions about open science. The whole funding call was really about supporting open science, but by focusing on the CARE principles as well as FAIR, and if people don't know what CARE are, I'll get into those a little bit. I think it's a really important bit of nuance to discussions about open science that I don't always see in the hard sciences. So I'm going to start by just giving a brief introduction to what this project is and some basics of FAIR and CARE. I know that a lot of folks might know about those a little bit, but I thought it could be useful to at least go through how they intersect and how they don't intersect in some cases. I'm going to try to keep it to 20 to 30 minutes because I think that's what Morgan said. And I have like some slides from the workshop that we just gave that kind of demonstrate how a FAIR concept kind of looks through a CARE lens, or starts to look as we start to think about it through it, but only if interested and only if we have time. And yeah, please feel free to ask questions throughout. So like I said, this is a recently funded NSF project, and it's called a Pharos RCN. So findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, open science research coordination networks. It's an absolutely terrible acronym, but at least they managed to get it down to two little words. So this is a set of research coordination networks that were aimed at, I think the two areas are developing disciplinary improvements targeted to specific scientific communities to make data more accessible, or cross-cutting improvements that apply to most or many scientific disciplines. The general goal is to support open science. There's, I think, about, I wasn't able to find a slide that was easy to pull together showing all of the RCNs that were funded, but two others that I know about. One is Research Coordination Network for people working with computer tomography data, so CT scans and things like that, and trying to make those files more accessible and open and develop some better data curation standards for them. And there's another based, I believe, at the University of Minnesota, working with institutional repositories and based in the library, looking at making scholarship more broadly accessible. So it's a really diverse group of grants. We were thrilled to have this funded, and for us, we kind of sit in between these disciplinary improvements and these cross-cutting improvements, because we're trying to target at a very specifically interdisciplinary community. And that's for the, and that specific interdisciplinary community is for those studying recent past global change. So focusing on the Quaternary period, meaning 2.58 million years to present, trying to bring together archaeology and recent paleontology data and infrastructures to study past ecological or global scale change that's happened. And there's a couple really big challenges to this. The first that I want to really highlight is the colonial legacy of many collections. So when you're working with archaeology data, you of course have to think about where did that archaeology data come from, both from what's the provenance of the specific data and who are the people that that data was taken from, usually without their consent. And when I say data, I'm also thinking about things like, well, it's all data derived from artifacts most of the time, or from archaeological sites, human remains, things like that. This might be something that folks in ESIP do not usually have to think about, because for many earth scientists, one of the attractions is that maybe you don't have to talk to people as much as you might in other fields. But in archaeology, that's a concern first and foremost. And so there's also another challenge is just the diversity of data types. So just from a technical interoperability perspective, it's very hard to bring together lots of different kinds of data sets to use for different scientific analyses, both because those data will have different formats, but they'll also just be about different stuff, and people have different norms depending on the field. And yeah, you have to build these crosswalking standards that are of varying degrees of useful to actually bring all that work together to do science. But these challenges are important to tackle because the past global change can inform the study and mitigation of current climate change. And so that's a really big driver of our work. but also especially when we're thinking about trying to undo, maybe not, we can't undo, but trying to help heal parts of this colonial legacy. I think that's a really important next step for the earth sciences in general, and for really all fields in general. So both two really big and important challenges. I'm going to skip this slide. So our goals, more specifically, we want to build technical and social capacity by supporting technical implementation of ethical open science principles, and developing communities of practice focused on care and Pharos principles. And so can I get in like the chat or in hands or something, how many people are familiar with the FAIR principles already? I'm not seeing any hands. So that means I should explain them more. Okay.
I would explain them. There are a couple of thumbs and a couple of hands.
Okay, cool. So familiar. What about the care principles? I'm seeing, yeah, a head shake and fewer thumbs up.
One thumb.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so these are the two kind of guiding principles or ideals that we're trying to meet with this project, and I will unpack those a little bit more. And this diagram is meant to be the most, it is both hard to unpack and probably the easiest or the most succinct summary of what our project is trying to do. So we have these three aims: to improve interoperability and reproducibility, to enable fair data curation and stewardship, and to support equity and improve access of these data infrastructures. And these arrows are meant to show that they're all routing through these principles of fair and care into these triangles of outputs that we're hoping for. It's a pretty big PI team. Jessica Bloys is the lead PI. She's at UC Merced, she's a paleontologist. Also Jack Williams and Simon Goring at University of Wisconsin. And Megan Balk, who was at NEON and is now a postdoc at somewhere in Oslo. And on the right-hand side, we have mostly our archaeological PIs: Lee Lieberman, Kitty Emery, Michelle Lefebvre, I forget how to say her name, and Susie Pilar Birch. But these, so it's a good blend of paleontologists and paleoecologists and archaeologists, and I'm kind of the lone information scientist, although with, because I've been hanging out at ESIP for so long, more expertise in the geosciences versus archaeology or something like that. So for our challenges and goals, aim 1, to improve interoperability and reproducibility. Like I said, there's these big differences among data resources in the degree of adoption of data standards, and also just in the type and format of data that different data resources hold that are relevant to this recent past global change topic. Second challenge, data resource growth and complexity. There are, I think we're all aware that there's a ton of different repositories out there and a ton of different data standards, and we all would love to be doing open science ideally. But many researchers are unsure of how and where to best contribute their data, and how to access data from across existing resources, or how to implement best practice. So that ties into aim 2, which is enabling fair data curation and stewardship, and kind of lowering the bar for doing that within these specific fields. And then finally, a big challenge, there's a ton of inequity in science. So a lot of scientific practices carry legacies of past and present colonialism and lead to inequities in data access, data distribution, and data governance. That's probably the biggest challenge. Like the technical challenges, we can write standards until, we turn blue. But solving inequities is something that requires collaboration and long-term consistent effort from our entire field. So we realize that this is a really big challenge, but we've all been very excited to start trying to tackle it. So I listed the PIs already. There's also a number of infrastructures that are involved in this project, some of which are probably familiar. So in the paleoecology, paleontology side, there's things like the Neotoma database, which is a paleoecological resource drawn from multiple other databases, focusing both on vertebrate paleontology and like palynology and lots of things in between. The paleobiology database, which is a repository of basically paleontological occurrences that are drawn from the paleontological literature. And I won't go through all of these, but like FUTRES is a NSF-funded initiative bringing together trait data from species. So that's all the paleoecological space. For modern ecology, we have NEON and GBIF, so both two big biodiversity occurrence aggregators. From archaeology, we have Open Context, TDAR, and a couple of others. Open Context is the one I'm most familiar with. It's a really well put together archaeological repository run by Eric and Sarah Kanza, and very standards driven, and that's been around for a couple decades at this point. Then finally in paleoclimatology, working with Linked Earth and some NOAA resources. And behind all of these online databases are actual physical specimens and samples. So some of our PIs are from the Florida Museum, where they're working directly with archaeological specimens. And I'm a PI on the iSamples project, which is aiming to, iSamples stands for the Internet of Samples, which hopefully some of you have at least heard of. The idea of it is that it's an interdisciplinary aggregator of records about physical samples and specimens, whether it's from paleontology, archaeology, biodiversity, or more. So big group of interconnecting data resources. So this is a 3-year project. I'm only going to talk about what we've just done because for year 1, we just held our first symposium at Biosphere 2. If you were here before the meeting formally started, you got to hear me talk about that a little bit. But the project, because it's a research coordination network, we do have some concrete things that we're trying to develop. One thing that I'm working on is a white paper that we're calling Mapping the Informatics Landscape. So better understanding and summarizing all of the different resources, standards, and interoperability challenges within the quaternary informatics space. And so, but a big part of it is just trying to build community. So every year we're having a symposium, and our year 1 symposium was our kickoff, just us getting to know each other. The PI team is big, and most of us did not know, had not actually met each other until this past week when we were at the Biosphere. So it was really good for that. Goals of these symposiums are things like building relationships, or at least for this year 1 symposium was building relationships, trying to get to know each other, and trying to understand where we all sit disciplinarily. Second goal was learning and self-studying, trying to figure out where we're all at. Because we all come to this project with different amounts of knowledge about FAIR and CARE. And then finally, setting up a work plan for the year. What's needed to work towards solutions to these various challenges and interoperability and opportunities. I only included 2 of the many pictures that I took last week. If you haven't seen the Biosphere, I highly recommend checking it out. It's really wild. But in our workshop overall, we mostly, I feel like it was actually a very successful workshop. I feel like we as a team are mostly on the same page about, or I think as our PI, Jessica Bloy said it, we're definitely all on the same page, though some of us might be on different parts of the page. But we got a good understanding of what our goals are for the next year. A lot of us are really focusing, before doing too many things, on just reading and learning. We are working, one significant drawback on the project so far, and something that we've identified for sure as the main point of potential failure, is that we have very limited Indigenous representation on our team and in our advisory board. And part of that is because of the usual challenges of trying to build community and build these networks with groups that we haven't worked with before. And that's something that we're going to be working really hard on remedying over the last year. But we also had some discussion about how it's important for us as people in positions of power and privilege, and a predominantly white PI team, to kind of get our own house in order a little bit before starting to reach out to communities. And we realized that that's not ideal. And in a perfect world, we would have done that before even getting the grant. But grant timelines don't align in best of ways. And this came up, and it was an opportunity that we went for. So I think this year, a lot of us are really going to be working hard on better understanding the impacts of colonialism on these communities and thinking about how that applies to the collections that we are working with and want to make more open. Another big theme was thinking about when is openness bad? And I know that that might be a controversial sort of sentence in the open science cluster, but I think it's really important to consider. I know your theme for this first part is thinking about trust. And I would frame it as one important part of building trust with communities and building trust for a repository is making sure that at risk, or I don't want to say at risk, making sure that marginalized communities are not being further harmed in the pursuit of open science, which is something that absolutely can happen with Indigenous data, or with the opening of data related to Indigenous people. So we had a lot of good discussion around that. A big project also for this year is the idea of mapping FAIR and CARE standards, and I'll dive into these a little bit in a second. So FAIR standards are mostly these very kind of technically focused, and I think I've got a slide on this. I do not. Okay. FAIR standards are mostly technically focused. It's about what do you need to do to make a piece of metadata show up in search results, or what do you need to do to make data reusable in a larger, how do you integrate it into a larger data set? Whereas the CARE standards are focused on people. They're focused on policies and things like that. What are the impacts of making data open or something like that? So, and this image was made by Michelle and Lee, two of the PIs on the team, and with me chiming in as best I can. But a big thing we want to do is think about what are the places of overlap and potentially even conflict or contradiction between these two standards. I don't think that they're actually going to contradict too much, but I do think that we have to shift our view of what open science is and what, we have to shift and add some nuance to our view of open and ethical science in some of these cases. So a quick overview of FAIR. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I didn't include my slide on this, but these are standards that were developed by a group of mostly bioinformatics people, and summarizing a lot of work that had gone into supporting data stewardship in a range of fields, both like even within earth science informatics and library and information science. So this is a small grudge that I have, but FAIR is not something, it's a really great acronym and a really easy way to talk about this as a concept, but a lot of the work and thinking about some of this work around data stewardship has been already happening for decades within different communities. So I want to make sure to point that out. So yeah, FAIR is about findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Within the paper describing these standards and some other auxiliary like materials, there's a bunch of very specific explanations of what counts as FAIR. So making something findable includes things like assigning global unique identifiers to data and metadata, describing them with rich describing data with rich metadata. Making something accessible means that metadata are retrievable by that identifier and through open protocols. Interoperable means using formal, accessible, shared, broadly applicable languages for knowledge representation. So basically using standards. And using vocabularies that are open. And reusable means more metadata, lots of and clear licenses for use and clear provenance so that you know where the data came from and can reevaluate the trustworthiness of that data. But like I said, FAIR prioritizes technical capacity and it doesn't discuss people and purpose. Like what are your goals in using this data and what are the social and political contexts in which this data is being used and reused. The CARE guidelines, on the other hand, these were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, led by Stephanie Carroll, who is actually a professor here at UA, and I'm very excited to have an excuse to talk to more. The CARE guidelines are about focusing, doing that centering on, on people and purpose. So CARE stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. The guidelines are rooted in a lot of well-known and long-term, these are problems that we've had for a long time, issues with collections from Indigenous people, from Native Americans, and those colonialist collections, basically. So these slides I'm borrowing from Lee Lieberman, but when she talks about this, ties this to issues of repatriation and continual struggles for countries to get their stuff back from places that collected it. So we've probably heard about like issues with like the British Museum refusing to return various artifacts to places like Greece and Rome. Within the US and maybe North America more broadly, there's been a lot of major issues around returning Native American remains. So in that case, all of the returning remains falls under NAGPRA, which is federal legislation about the repatriation of remains. The CARE guidelines are meant to fill a gap about the derived data from those artifacts and remains. And the premise being that sharing that Indigenous people should have sovereignty over the derived data as well as the physical objects. And because continued harm can happen from sharing that digital data. So going through what each of these acronyms mean a little bit more. So C for collective benefit, it means that data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from the data. So does this database actually make it possible for Indigenous people to derive benefit from it? A for authority to control. Indigenous people's rights and interests, and Indigenous data should be recognized, and their authority to control such data should be empowered. This means respecting Indigenous people as being from sovereign nations and giving them the ability to say what they can, what folks can and can't do with their data. R for responsibility, those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And this means meaningful and openly available evidence of these efforts and the benefits accruing to Indigenous peoples. And finally, E for ethics, Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. So for us, we're starting in thinking about how to apply CARE principles to paleoecological and archaeological databases. We're starting with a few things. First, just assessment and self-reflection. So identifying the technical and cultural needs to support CARE principles, and then learning and application, developing a shared understanding of the importance of these, and developing capacity for leaders within and beyond the RCN to implement these principles. We're starting with these two of the data repositories that are affiliated with our project. First, Thomer, that paleoecological database, and Open Context, an archaeological database. And a big activity for year one, and will probably take more than year one, is looking through each of those principles within the acronym of CARE and thinking about where are we not meeting those goals in a lot of different ways. Yeah, I think that's about where I'm gonna end for now and stop for questions. And if people want me to talk more about like looking at some aspects of FAIR through a CARE lens, I can. I think the last thing I want to say is that getting back to the application of CARE within the earth sciences, I said before, a lot of geoscientists might think that this doesn't necessarily apply to them because the materials in their repositories are not about people. And I think, though, it's still important to think about the lands from which these materials are coming from, and thinking about what potential colonial actions might have led to the collections of those specimens, or are there colonial actions that our repositories can enable? And these are hard questions, and it requires a lot of self-reflection, and it requires a lot of thinking about like what are the underlying motivations in a really deep way of some of the work that we're doing. I think like one of the participants at our workshop said something to the effect of, a lot of indigenous communities don't like having geologists on their lands because the best way to prevent mines is to keep geologists out. So that's one example of, how data that we think of as relatively benign can eventually lead to harm to a community in the long term, or lead to at least to the people coming in that they don't want in, if that makes any sort of sense. So I'm going to stop sharing there and pause for questions. And I hope that made sense.
Thanks ever so much, Andrea. Really interesting presentation. And I wanted to open it up for questions. And also I wanted to say thanks very much to Sky for the helpful comments in the chat. Sky, you have a hand up. Is that a question?
Yeah, I guess maybe a little bit of a question and a comment. A lot of this is not, just about past practices and past data. It's about sort of what we're doing currently. In USGS, we have gone through a transformation over the last few years in terms of our policy toward dealing with all of the data collection that touches on sovereign lands, on Native American lands throughout our country, where previously our policy explicitly stated, well, we'll do our best to reach out and check to see if we can make a contact with a particular tribe, but if we don't, we can go ahead and run remote sensing operations and gather data through remote sensing instruments, whether they're satellites or others. So now that's changed quite a bit. And we have a major program now called Earth MRI that's collecting a lot of new data, throughout the US. We're really trying to get wall-to-wall coverage of high resolution LiDAR and geochemistry and other data. And, now our policy is we don't engage in that until we've made contact, and unless we've made contact, developed relationships that ensure that Native tribes are able to have a say in what goes on and have ownership over data that are collected if they want those data to be collected. So I guess the question out of all this is, have you sort of thought about looking at things from that policy angle, sort of across the board with, agencies, with, the Science Foundation, with universities themselves, with others, just to see sort of what is the policy landscape today, both in writing and in spirit and practice, and sort of how that's playing out, if that's a piece of things that you're looking at.
Yeah, I definitely think that'll be part of it. I'm not sure if it'll fall into, so I'm leading, or Natalie eventually will be leading, because Natalie Raya will be joining as a postdoc on this project. This idea of mapping the informatics landscape, and that would definitely include repository policies. There's also a group working on, similarly, I don't think this is the exact phrasing that they're using, but the idea is to map the care landscape. So understanding what policies are in place at that higher level that you're talking about. But we did not talk a ton about like agency policies, and that's a really great that's a great point, and we will definitely add that to what we're doing, because I wasn't aware that USGS had shifted that, and that's great, and that's really helpful to know that these large federal agencies are having these conversations already.
Thanks for the questions, Guy. Other questions? Hi, Bree. How are you? Now, I do not have your audio. Does anybody else?
No.
Hmm. You appear to be unmuted, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm just gonna type it.
Well, hi, this is Lorraine. In the silence, I'll just make a comment. I thought that presentation was fantastic. I was recently at an open science conference in Boston a couple weeks ago. And then before that, I was at American Meteorological Society Washington Forum on a panel on open science, and where trust was a major concern, especially around data. And so seeing this care and fair, I had not seen these two intertwine before. I've seen a lot on the fair side. I'm with Esri, and we have a Living Atlas of the World repository of many different types of data. And we try to follow fair principles as well, but seeing care come into play as well I just really enjoyed how you presented it, and the thought process, and thinking about this project that you're about to embark on. And the first phase of it is to really try to ensure that you're adopting both care and fair, and what does that really mean? And I just, based on my last sets of discussions, like on a panel and at a conference, it's top of mind for many, is how to ensure that our data is fair, and that we're working in, I would say, more care principles, although that's not what everybody was calling it. So now I'm going to add that to my vernacular and spread that for sure. But thank you so much. Today
That's
was
great.
just
Thank you.
incredible.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad that this is relevant to stuff people are thinking about. And I do want to definitely emphasize that this is, I am presenting work from the entire team. It's a 100% not just me. So it's been really great to work with this group and realize that we're all thinking about these things in ways that a lot of us didn't realize that we were all thinking about these things in similar ways. Yeah, one thing I did share at the workshop was that the only time I've gotten a lot of annoying heat on Twitter is when I dared to like question naive and blanket open access policies by saying something mild like, hey, maybe we should have embargoes for junior researchers. And so like these topics can get really heated in open science spaces, because and it's not saying open science is bad by any means. It's saying that we have to make sure who it's open for and what's the impact of that openness, and making sure that it is what we want out of openness. So Sky, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, one thing that occurred to me with the comment from Esri and your comment earlier about sort of realizing that you have a gap in terms of participation in the project from Indigenous researchers and other folks that you might want to have involvement in. One of the things that we're hearing, and both in my USGS work and some other things that I'm involved in, is quite a bit of overload on the part of tribes these days. There are so many different groups that are pushing so hard to develop relationships and make up for some of the things that we've done in the past that have really been quite inequitable, that there's a lot of overload. And coming at tribes these days with hey, we've got this new thing and we'd really love to collaborate and whatnot is kind of a bit much. So I mean, one of the powers of ESIP and engaging in this through ESIP is potentially leveraging existing relationships that we have here in various ways. And I mean, even through, commercial groups like Esri that have a number of relationships with some tribes, tribal governments in particular, who are using their product. I think there are all kinds of ways that, we can maybe do a little bit of sleuthing around the community on where existing relationships are that we might be able to jump in on and leverage with, new things that we're coming up with to move ahead on.
That's a great suggestion. That's a really great point. And yeah, about the, that was part of, we also talked about how, a lot of Native American groups are just totally overtaxed, and they will not, very reasonably, are not particularly interested in responding to a cold email, hey, will you be on this random advisory board, until maybe they've seen that you're actually doing something. This was something that a couple of folks were talking about, and it's like, yes, of course. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to just shout out Bree's question. So thanks very much for the presentation. Awesome to hear about Earth MRI. And I think this is an incredibly relevant question. When data is collected from space globally, how do we start thinking about care principles? And I also wanted to add to that, in terms of the focus of the project, is it mainly domestic, or kind of how broad is that? And I'm thinking with regard to Indigenous people, local communities in tropical countries, for example.
Yeah, these are all great questions. So first, for when data is collected from space, so meaning like satellite data, or it's such a good question, and we did not talk about that at all last week, but I do think part of it is thinking about, is it one of the care principles, is it accessible and usable to Indigenous communities? So that might be one place for it. And also checking into, like, how do they feel about being, I don't know, about showing up on this satellite data. I know that that's something that we're not checking with every country about, how they feel about showing up on satellite data maybe, but I think that's one place I would start. So are we making this of use to these communities somehow in a concerted sort of way?
Yeah.
And as far as, what was the second question, Jenny?
Oh, just the geographical focus of the project.
Yeah, we're mostly North American and mostly US, I should specify, because it's an NSF-funded project. But there's a lot of interest in getting beyond that. We had some representation, like we had one person from Australia as part of it, and one of our advisory board members, Ricky Punzalan, does a lot of work in the Philippines, because he is from the Philippines. So he works with Indigenous communities there and trying to repatriate collections, or at least reconnect them to Filipino Americans throughout, Filipino Americans. So mostly focusing on North America. We do have interest in getting beyond that. And I think part of it is just starting small in a manageable sort of community. And then thinking about how we could strategically reach out. So.
Thanks, Andrea. Other questions? Okay, one comment actually that Sky made that I wanted to circle back to is this idea of how to leverage the partnerships within the ESIP community to ensure that that Indigenous communities, for example, are not overburdened, because I think that is a significant problem, that you have these constant groups, different groups coming to ask for how it may affect you, whether you would want to contribute to a board, etc. And I think that is something that is definitely worth a discussion. It's not something that I have thought about, and thanks very much, Sky, for kind of highlighting that. I don't know if others have thoughts on that.
Hi, this is Lorraine again from Esri. I now have that on my mind today. I mean, like I said, I've just been back from vacation and I've been on the road a bit, and we have a large tribal group that we work with. And so now I'm going to check in with them and see what's been happening on the open science space, because I have been on the road a bit, even at EGU. Our theme was open science, and our friends at NASA were there. That was their theme as well. And then again, the panel and a conference all together. So, and with this presentation today, it's got me very excited to start to look into it a little bit deeper. And so perhaps I could take the homework of actually doing that, even within our commercial space, and see what we're doing on the tribal side with respect to, as I said before, we had FAIR, but let's see what on the care side, because we also have a large research project going at in California here, our nature preserve. It's part of the Dangerman Preserve, and where it's a large ecological research project with about 30 PIs associated with that team. And I usually meet with them once a month. And they also have a lot of Indigenous data and are very respectful of that, and learning about how they're dealing with the field of open science, where not everything is open. There's certain data sets that are closed, and how they're dealing with that. So I'm going to take that as an action item to, may take me a full month to get something to report back, but I'd like to do that, especially given what was presented today.
That's great.
Thanks ever so much for that, Lorraine. Yeah, that would be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I think two things.
Sorry, Andrea.
I was going to say one thing we talked about in the symposium was, so a lot of us are trying to just learn right now. And someone brought up the Unlearning Racism in the Geosciences initiative from a few years back. And so we might start a reading group, and that might be something where we reach out or just like share it with the ESIP community more broadly, and try to do a similar sort of initiative where if folks are interested, they can join in that. And also, I should say, if folks are interested in getting involved in this RCN, please reach out to me, and we will have more symposia in the future. And we're always looking for people to try to bring in this. And there might be, we're hoping to have ways of like having this be a broader community effort, and not just us 30 people that happen to meet this past time.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, any final comments? Well, I think this was a fascinating webinar one, and a great introduction to the webinar series. Thanks ever so much for presenting today. And
This is great.
And I think the cat did quite well in not interrupting too much. No. It sounds like a fascinating project as well. And maybe if you could pop your email in the chat, that would be helpful for the group. I think we have a number of potential follow-ons as well from today. Our next clustered telecon is the 27th of June, and we will have webinar 2 on Tuesday, the 27th of June. All right, all, if there are no final comments, thanks ever so much for participating today, and we'll have the recording as well as the chat captured.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all.